In the past decade, there's been a 14% rise in adult children living with their parents. That's an extra 640,000 young adults struggling to move out of home. But perhaps those living at home with a subsidised rent are the lucky ones, because the rental sector has failed to keep up with demand. In the past 2 years, at a time of inflation and low wage growth, we have seen a 22% rise in rents, faster than incomes. Average rents in England are now £1,300 a month, £2,000 in London, and the quality is often poor. Up to 2.6 million live in crowded, draughty and overcrowded conditions. Yet renters are forced to chase any empty property which comes onto the market, up to 25 prospective tenants per property. It wasn't always like this. In 1980, average house prices were £23,000, and by comparison median wages a little over £6,000 a year. It meant that at just over 3 times income, buying a house was within reach of the average worker. But today house prices are nearly 10 times that level at £265,000. But median wages have increased to only £35,000. It means house prices are nearly twice as expensive, nearly 8 times average earnings. The average deposit for first-time buyers has reached £53,000, and that's even higher in London. It means the old dream of home ownership has faded. And before people complain about the extravagant spending habits of young people, to save for an average deposit would take 401 years of a standard Netflix subscription. You can't buy a house by foregoing avocados and lattes. The housing ladder has been pulled away from most young people. Now, for many years, the UK benefited from strong economic growth and a post-war boom in the housing supply. It caused the rate of home ownership to rise from 30% just after the war to a record of 73% in 2008. However, in the past 16 years, this story has changed. Young people have been priced out. Since 1997, house prices have risen twice as fast as incomes. And apart from sticking plaster policies like Help to Buy, there have been few successful attempts to do anything about it. In fact, Help to Buy was just a way to enable young people to borrow more. A House of Parliament report found it was a poor use of public money, inflating prices and not tackling the underlying problem. From 2008 to 2022, we had a period of ultra-low interest rates. This was really great for those who were able to buy. Mortgages were very cheap, and unsurprisingly they caused a boom in house prices. But today just 54% of adults are home owners. The problem is that not only have house prices risen, but with higher interest rates, the cost of mortgages has gone up as well. For first-time buyers, the share of income going on mortgage payments has increased substantially in the past 2 years, and it looks like staying at this level or similar for the foreseeable future. Unsurprisingly, there's been a fall in mortgage lending and a fall in the number of outstanding owner-occupied mortgages. Young people now face 3 major barriers to buying a house: much higher deposits, repayment affordability increasing, and access to mortgage tightened since the 2008 financial crash. And increasingly we see a divide between young people who can count on the help of their parents and those who don't. If you're a 30-year-old whose parents have no wealth, there's just a 20% chance you'll be able to own a house. But if your parents have substantial wealth, that rate almost doubles. Of course, home ownership is not everything. Young people are more likely to be mobile and not necessarily keen on buying a property. In other countries like Austria and France, renting is seen as a fair, decent option because there's a plentiful supply of affordable accommodation. But in the UK, the private rented sector is really struggling to keep up. For many decades, the UK built substantial quantities of social housing. It provided subsidised rent for low-income households. Rent caps really don't work in the private sector because the private sector will then supply less. If you want to limit rents, you have to provide for housing at the same time. But starting in the 1980s, the programme of social housing building ground to a halt, and existing council properties were sold off. Now, it was understandably popular for those who were able to buy their own rented property at a discount, but the proceeds were never really reinvested in building new houses. The UK lost nearly 1.5 million council houses, but the number of households continued to rise very significantly, and the private rented sector wasn't prepared for this influx of demand. Rents rose even as income stagnated. In fact, a key problem of the past 15 years is that average incomes have almost stagnated, just very small increase. For several decades, we got used to rapid economic growth and wages rising by an average of 2%. But this seems to have come to an abrupt halt since the last financial crisis. But it's not just about incomes. Young people also face a new set of costs that previous decades didn't experience. In 1980, just 14% of young adults went to university, but recently that rate has increased to 50%. But it has come at a cost of high tuition fees and high debt. Since 1999, the average debt of an English student on leaving university has increased from 2,500 to 45,000. By the way, in Scotland it's just 15,000. In a bizarre twist, average student debt is pretty close to the average deposit for first-time buyers. It's a double whammy for young people: high debt, high deposit, and how can you save when rents are so high? However, the supply of graduates has not necessarily been matched by an increase in demand for graduate jobs. And to make things worse, nearly a third of graduate jobs are in London, which means dealing with a crazy London rented sector, where new rent properties are around 2,600. It means that even with a decent graduate job of 3,000 or 4,000 a month, disposable income can soon dissipate on rent, student loan repayments, and other cost of living pressures. No wonder young people feel frustrated. And as I always tell my students, you might be better financially off becoming a plumber or electrician or builder than going to university. I don't know if their parents would approve, but it may well help them to leave home earlier with a well-paying job rather than high student debt. Immigration is very much in the public eye at the moment. It has pros and cons, which would take a whole video to do. But I think it's fair to say that one of the drawbacks at the moment is that the very high levels of migration we've seen in recent years has put upward pressure on the housing market and the rented sector in particular. The number of households has risen very quickly, and there's been no corresponding increase in the supply of private rented properties. The problem is that many private landlords have actually been retreating from the market due to tax changes, higher interest rates, and the end of the speculative price rises we saw in recent decades. And at the same time, government targets to build more houses have frequently failed to get anywhere close to their targets. So this combination of rising demand and weak supply has caused prices to edge up. And the UK faces some of the worst housing costs in the developed world. According to OECD, 53% of low-income private tenants are spending more than 40% of their income on housing. And this housing stress is reflected in rising homelessness rates, which again is one of the highest in the developed world. Now, it presents a pretty bleak outlook for young people. Housing is genuinely unaffordable, and there's also all the pressures from low wage growth, high tuition fees, high debt. No wonder the UK fertility rate is set to plummet. But is all the gloom exaggerated? It's not all bad for young people. If we go back to 1980, unemployment was 3 million, 12% of the population, even higher for young people. Today, the problem is more a shortage of workers. It may not be a very well-paid job, it may not be very secure, but unemployment at least is low. The past 15 years have been pretty grim for wage growth, but there's a hope that affordability of housing may start to improve. Already the ratio of house prices to incomes has fallen from a peak of 9 to around 8 income, And if house price inflation remains subdued as expected, we might see some more small, marginal improvements in affordability. University education is really expensive, but also it's an opportunity that previous generations didn't necessarily have. And although the past 10 years of wage growth has been pretty grim, maybe it'll start to improve in the coming decade. Also, what about Labour's plan to solve the housing crisis by building 1.5 million new homes? And if they're actually able to achieve it, will they make house prices cheaper? This video looks into whether it's possible.